It's interesting to look at the progression of some stories. For instance, the 1904 novel A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett started out in 1888 as a serialized novella of about a third of the size. In 1902, the novella was adapted into a 3-act stage play, which did very successfully on Broadway. During the rewriting process, Burnett discovered a number of characters and events that had been left out of her original novella. So, in 1904, she published the longer and more detailed work that we have today. The story of a clever, kind, and imaginative little girl named Sarah Crewe was so compelling that it has inspired a number of productions in the visual media, most for the stage, but a few for the screen. Which is where we get our 1939 movie, A Little Princess, starring Shirley Temple. Chalk up another win for books.
Hold it. We are not reviewing the Shirley Temple movie.
We're not?
No. As it happens, a newer and better adaptation of this story exists, released by Warner Brothers in 1995, starring Liesl Matthews and Eleanor Braun, and directed by then relative newcomer Alfonso Cuaron, who you might recognize as the guy who directed the third Harry Potter movie. This is the movie we'll be looking at today, Matt, and I think you'll find you'll have a little bit more of a fight on your hands, because A Little Princess happens to be one of my favorite movies.
Well, it also happens to be one of my favorite books, so we've got another battle on our hands. This is Books vs. Movies review of A Little Princess. Categories are going to work a little differently for this review. We are going to work backwards so that we end with the main character, because in this story, the main character really is the most important aspect.
So we'll begin by taking a look at story. Let's start by looking at perhaps the biggest difference between the two stories. This is basically just a Cinderella story. This little girl is dropped off at a boarding school where she's easily the favorite until her father seems to die, leaving her penniless, and then she has to work as a servant and is basically treated like scum until she gets her reward in the end. The main difference here is that in the book, the father actually dies. In the movie, everyone just thinks he does, and the two are reunited in the end.
Now you might think that this gives the book a darker ending, but that actually isn't the case at all. Both book and movie have basically a fairy tale ending, but they both go about it a little bit differently. First off, in the book, the father dies of a combination of jungle fever and financial stress. He put all of his money into a business venture that went badly, and as a result, died deeply in debt with no money to leave his daughter. This is a slightly better explanation of why Sarah suddenly becomes poor. In the movie, Captain Crewe is actually a soldier fighting in World War I. He's confused with a dead soldier, and the movie says that the government seizes all of his property. Which doesn't really make sense, since he clearly has a daughter who should be taken care of, and who should, by rights, inherit all of that. I mean, didn't he make out a will or anything? A soldier fighting in a very dangerous war where he could very easily be killed? He didn't make out a will? Didn't ensure for his daughter's well-being should he not come back alive? Really?
But this isn't entirely implausible, and the movie does make up for this failing by really developing the father-daughter relationship. In the book, the relationship between Sarah and her father really isn't focused on after he dies. That is to say, Sarah doesn't really dwell on her father's death as much as she dwells on her situation. In the movie, it's obvious that Sarah's father is her inspiration, and basically the reason why she is the way she is. While in the book, she just kind of is the way she is.
And I guess that's another major difference between book and movie. The book is basically a character study of Sarah Crewe and how she responds to all these situations she finds herself in. And even though it's all tied together, it sometimes reads more like a series of vignettes than one long story.
The movie, on the other hand, puts focus on the overall storyline. Now, it certainly doesn't sacrifice Sarah's character development, but there is a little bit more of a compact story. To be honest, though, it's hard to say which version I like better, as they both give us an incredibly compelling story, and they both have an equally happy, though probably completely implausible, ending.
The book's ending shows us how all the good that Sarah did and the effect that she had on people eventually came back to benefit her, which is a little bit more of an interesting and compelling way to tell the classic Cinderella story. The movie's ending is a bit more traditional in the fairy tale, they all lived happily ever after sense, especially the very last scene.
But on the other hand, the reunion between Sarah and her father is probably one of the more dramatically touching scenes I've ever seen. The scene that follows is admittedly a little hokey, but then again, I guess the point of this version is that Sarah is living out her fairy tale, so it only makes sense to give it a fairy tale ending. Also, because of the way it's structured, the book doesn't really have a climax. It just kind of stops. It ends happily and on a high note, but it is kind of an odd ending. The book's ending does show us one of the many ways in which Sarah's kindness affected other people. While the movie ends with Sarah, the book ends with someone else, somebody that she affected, as if she's passing something on. So in the end, they're both on about the same level, each with their pros and cons. But I think what really decides it for me is how each story defines princess. In the book, a little princess refers to how Sarah carries herself, especially when she's in her state of drudgery. She maintains that proud sense of self-worth, and it's this that keeps her going. In a sense, the movie has that too, but it also adds another message that the book doesn't focus on as much. The idea that all girls are princesses, no matter what they look like, how smart they are, or what their station in life is.
Even if they live in tiny old attics? Even if they dress in rags? Even if they aren't pretty, or smart, or young? They're still princesses. All of us.
The princess message in the book is more focused on Sarah, whereas the princess message in the movie is more focused on all girls. And just like with Matilda, I prefer the message that is more universally empowering rather than what is empowering for one girl. In general, the movie put more focus on the other people in Sarah's life, treating them more like equals to her rather than subordinates, which is what the book tended to do. Overall, even though both stories are moving and powerful in their own way, I prefer the movie's more universal message to the book's focus on one girl. But can Alfonso Cuaron's whimsical direction match Burnett's descriptive world? Let's take a look at Imagery. If you've seen Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, then you already know about Cuaron's trademark quirkiness, and he certainly brings that into this movie. Regardless of whether you loved or hated the third Harry Potter movie, this film really does have some great direction, making it look like the modern fairy tale that it is. To that end, it also weaves this story to another fairy tale that Sarah tells her friends throughout the film. Sarah's defining characteristic is that she likes to pretend, to make up stories. It's this trait that eventually helps Sarah to survive, as she pretends to be a princess in order to keep from snapping. The book's portrayal of this trait is actually pretty clever. One of the things that Sarah likes to do is people watch, and she starts watching this one particular family, even giving them their own names and backstory. The children of this family, as it happens, are doing something similar with her, and their father is actually the lawyer of the man who eventually adopts Sarah. It's almost like the kind of scenario we might imagine for ourselves if we're in a crummy situation, only in this case, it's Sarah's reality. A lot of the elements of this story read like a fairy tale, which is as it should be, because this is a fairy tale in its own way. In fact, it even describes Sarah's luck and Mr. Carrisford's kindness as magic. Because movie Sarah's story ends somewhat differently than book Sarah's does, the fairy tale elements are a little different as well. For instance, the hero in the story that Sarah is telling is actually her father. Now, unlike the Shirley Temple movie, this Sarah actually accepts that her father is dead, but we can see in the telling of this story that she has a faint hope that it's not true. Also, you'll notice that all the stories Sarah tells take some sort of dark turn where all seems lost for the hero, but then something comes along to save the day, which is basically this story in a nutshell. Add some imaginative sets, some innovative camera work, and some great atmosphere, and you've got the sort of modern-day fairy tale that Burnett intended.